These are the best PC graphic settings for the highest performance in Xdefiant. For today's video, I visually compared and benchmarked each and every graphic setting in Xdefiant to help you find the best balance between high performance and good visibility. The two systems that I used for today's video are shown on screen right now, one of which is an Intel system with an NVIDIA GPU, whereas the other one is my all AMD gaming rig. All of my tests for today's video have been performed at 1440p in the practice zone of Xdefiant. A note on the performance graph: you can see here in red the performance metrics for the AMD system and in blue for the Intel system. The dark blue and red colors are for the average FPS and the light blue and light red colors are for the 1% lows. Starting with display mode, we have the option to play the game either at full screen or windowed borderless. From this comparison, we can see that on the AMD system there appears to be no difference whatsoever whether you're playing at full screen or windowed borderless, and on the Intel system we are seeing slightly worse performance on windowed borderless. On the other hand, it appears that the 1% lows are higher on both systems. However, I noticed that the 1% lows are extremely variable in Xdefiant, because also the GPU usage would randomly fluctuate between like 95 and 80%, and in those instances the 1% lows are no longer representative. So because of that, for the remainder of today's video I will mostly focus on the average FPS rather than on the 1% lows. Display resolution and refresh rate you want to set at the highest possible value, which is simply the native resolution and refresh rate of your monitor. Triple buffering I would highly recommend to turn off, because first of all there is no screen tearing in this game and this option introduces heavy input latency. Reduced latency supposedly is reducing our input latency. However, on both of my systems I am losing significant performance when enabling reduced latency, and on a system with an NVIDIA GPU I would generally recommend to use NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency. As for the AMD system, unfortunately I am not able to actually measure end-to-end input latency, and therefore I'm not able to say whether this option actually reduces input latency or not. On the other hand, with this option disabled, you are gaining more than 100 FPS, so in my opinion you should definitely leave this disabled. NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency should always be enabled whenever you have the option to, because this is a great measure to make sure that you have the least amount of input lag possible. Generally, in GPU-bound scenarios, you want to just enable this option, which is probably the most people that are playing Xdefiant, and if you are heavily CPU-bound, then you should set it to on plus boost. The DirectX 12 renderer is apparently much less performant than the DirectX 11 renderer. As you can see on both of my systems, I am losing a significant amount of performance when I enable this option. From a visual comparison, honestly, I really cannot tell any difference between DX11 and DX12, and because of that my recommendation would be to stick to DirectX 11. VSync should prevent screen tearing, however at this high frame rate you are never going to notice any screen tearing whatsoever, and because this option introduces a heavy penalty on the input latency, you should definitely disable this option. The frame rate limit I would always recommend to leave uncapped, especially if you have an NVIDIA GPU, because NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency is essentially a dynamic frame rate limiter. On the other hand, if you have an AMD GPU, then you could maybe set this to something above your monitor's refresh rate in order to get potentially lower input latency. However, you have to test this yourself. Now, if you're enjoying this huge effort that I'm putting into producing these FPS guides, then hit that like button and consider subscribing if you want to see more FPS guides also for other games. The shadow quality only slightly reduces performance in Xdefiant. I'm seeing roughly 2 to 3% on the high and very high options on both of my systems, and visually there really isn't too much of a difference between these options either. Spot shadows affects the amount of shadows that individual lighting sources can cast, and as you can see this option reduces performance by roughly 3%. From this comparison, you can see that this option primarily introduces more shadows to the scene and makes dark parts of the image even more dark, and that might make an operator a bit more difficult to actually spot, and for that reason I would actually recommend to set the spot shadows quality to the low setting. The performance that I'm showing for spot shadow resolution is actually for the situation where you have spot shadows set to high. So this is why the low is already at -3%, but you can see that increasing the spot shadow resolution from low to ultra reduces performance by roughly 7%. Visually, this option will make shadows more crisp and more resolved, and because the low preset looks that bad, my recommendation would be to run the game at medium or high spot shadow resolution just for shadows to look a little bit nicer. However, of course, if you want to get the absolute highest possible performance, then setting the spot shadow resolution to low will do the trick. Contact shadows are essentially shadows behind or around small objects, and from the performance graph you can see that this only slightly reduces performance. However, from a visual comparison, it is actually really hard to find any differences whatsoever, so this option should definitely be left disabled. Unless you are severely struggling with performance, I would always recommend to leave the resolution scale on 100%. This will make the game look the sharpest and the nicest, but it will also use the most performance. Generally, you will see a linear increase in performance when reducing resolution scale. Sharpening does not affect performance obviously, however here's a comparison of how the game looks with a sharpening value set to 0, 5 or 10. Evidently, the game looks much crisper and textures actually look much higher resolved when setting the sharpening to a value of 10, and that's why this would be my recommendation for this setting. Particle details apparently has no effect on performance whatsoever in Xdefiant, and I was also not able to find any examples of how this affects the visual quality of the game. But just to be sure that we're not seeing a dip in performance whenever a grenade goes off, my recommendation would be to leave it on low. For volumetric fog, in fact, I saw a pretty significant decrease in performance on both my systems, and from this comparison we can see that the low and medium preset introduce quite heavy fog in the scene, and visibility is clearly much better on high and ultra. However, given the rather significant impact on performance, my recommendation would be to leave this on low. The global reflection quality apparently has no impact on performance, at least not in the practice zone. And because I am usually not a big fan of shiny and nice and highly resolved reflections, my recommendation would be to leave this on low. Here is the performance impact of activating local reflection quality, and from a comparison we can see that reflections are just becoming much higher resolved, for instance in this puddle of water. However, the increase in visual fidelity is really not worth the hefty roughly 10% FPS penalty of either of these options, so again my recommendation would be to just leave this disabled. For vegetation quality, I wasn't able to find any significant differences in terms of performance, and visually the only apparent difference that I could find was that with the high preset, foliage would oddly produce fewer shadows, and I'm pretty sure that this option is simply bugged in Xdefiant as of this moment. Subsurface scattering slightly reduces performance, however it comes with absolutely no benefit in terms of the visual fidelity of the game and should thus be left disabled. Ambient occlusion in Xdefiant actually doesn't add additional shadows around objects to give them a more grounded appearance, but instead it actually increases the quality of those shadows around objects. As you can see from this comparison, increasing ambient occlusion clearly improves the visual fidelity of the game. Performance-wise, ambient occlusion is quite a heavy option. However, I would argue that running ambient occlusion on medium is definitely worth it, given the much cleaner image that this produces in-game. For object detail, I'm only seeing a slight reduction in performance, and because the object detail 0 setting is actually introducing additional shadows around different objects, my recommendation would actually be to set this to around 20 or 30 in order to get rid of these shadows, while at the same time having basically no FPS penalty at all. Extra streaming distance, interestingly, did not affect performance on my AMD-based system, but ever so slightly on my Intel-based system. And the reason for that is that on the Intel-based system, I have an RTX 4080 which has 16GB of VRAM, whereas the RX 7900 XTX GPU on the AMD-based system has 24GB, and thus has slightly more headroom. Visually, I wasn't able to tell where additional objects were introduced into the scene. Maybe there have been ever so slightly higher number of objects drawn, however there will be no difference noticeable, and therefore my recommendation would be to leave this option on 0. Whether or not you like lens flare comes down to personal preference. This obviously does not affect performance whatsoever. The water quality has a small impact on performance, and from the comparison we can see that the water in this little pond becomes slightly more realistic on the higher preset levels. The water isn't just a blue surface, and instead it's actually translucent where it's not very deep. So if you like this option or not kind of comes down to personal preference. You can certainly go up to medium and you're not going to lose a significant amount of performance, but if you're not spending all your game staring into puddles, then likely you want to leave this disabled as well. Whether or not you like chromatic aberration once again comes down to personal preference. Again, this has no impact on performance whatsoever. And finally, regarding the terrain quality, I wasn't able to see either a impact on performance on either of my systems, nor on the visual quality of the game. Now, in summarizing, here is a bit of an overview of how the performance of Xdefiant fares when running the game either in DX11 or DX12, and when having all of our settings set to low compared to having all of them set to ultra. As you can see, running the game in DX11 is beneficial over DX12, both on the high and low preset, and by bumping up the game from low to ultra, we're losing roughly 40% performance, which is definitely significant. From this comparison, you can see that going from low to ultra really isn't a huge deal when it comes to the visual quality of Xdefiant. Most notably, the reason for that is that there is actually no texture quality setting in Xdefiant, and it appears that the texture quality is set at a rather high value. Now, potentially, you might be able to reduce the texture quality through a config tweak, however, I haven't gone down that rabbit hole just yet. Finally, I'd also like to touch on the impact of field of view on performance. On this graph, we are moving from a field of view of 60 to 120 from left to right. Just like in Call of Duty, we are seeing actually higher performance for the higher field of view values, so do not reduce your field of view in order to boost FPS, but instead choose whatever field of view feels most natural for you to play at. So in summarizing, the best settings for the highest performance in Xdefiant are as follows: display mode full screen, reduced latency disabled, NVIDIA Reflex low latency if you have it set it to on, DirectX 12 renderer disabled, shadow quality low, spot shadows low, spot shadow resolution medium or low depending on whether you want higher quality or higher visual fidelity, contact shadows low, resolution scale 100, sharpening 10, particle details low, volumetric fog low, global reflection quality low, local reflection quality disabled, vegetation quality low, subsurface scattering disabled, ambient occlusion on medium, object details 20, extra streaming distance 0, lens flare down to personal preference, water quality low, chromatic aberration down to personal preference again, and terrain quality on low. And with that, I hope you get the best looking game at the highest possible performance. But that about wraps it up for today's video. Leave a like and comment down below what your experience in terms of performance has been in Xdefiant. Thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.